When we're setting up new equipment and our network, one of the first things we need to think about is physical security. How we're going to physically secure our equipment. And so in this video, let's go over physical security. In this video, we're going to talk about both threats and the protection against those threats. And so we're going to talk about how we protect our equipment and our networks. We're going to start out with just a brief mention around a threat agent. Then we're going to get into hardware threats, environmental threats, and electrical threats to our equipment and our network. Then we're going to get into how do we protect against that. A brief mention around access control. We'll talk about asset tracking. We'll get into hardware monitoring, environmental controls, and then we'll wrap things up talking about asset disposal. And what we're concerned about is that confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Although a lot of the aspects that we are going to talk about within this video really has to do with availability and making sure our systems remain up and running. And I'm not going to get in depth into a threat agent. Obviously, this is one of our top concerns, so I feel like I do need to mention it. But I cover this much more in depth in another video, so I'm not going to cover it in depth here. There are also hardware threats to our equipment. And so whether we accidentally drop a piece of equipment, or perhaps it gets hit by something, perhaps it gets submerged into water, maybe we have flooding in the data center. So we need to be concerned about what that looks like. So we would do things like bring the equipment up off the ground, so that way if there is flooding, we're protecting that equipment. But there are also other environmental threats, things that can happen to the environment that would affect our equipment. Humidity is one of those. That our equipment doesn't like extreme with the humidity. And so we need to keep it within a certain range. Same thing with temperature. You can't have a temperature that's really hot or a temperature that's really cold. That we need something in between. But also, just as important as that is some sort of consistency with that temperature. Equipment doesn't like our temperature to be going up and down, and so we want to maintain a consistency with that. And then we also have things like fire that can happen to our equipment and obviously damage the equipment. Then there are also electrical threats to our equipment. Things like power outages, which obviously would bring our equipment offline, and so we need a plan for that. Plan for the blackouts, which just means that the utility company doesn't have the power coming into there's no power service. Then what happens is sometimes there's spikes on the line, a sudden surge of electricity that can damage our equipment. And this often happens after a power outage. So that's be another concern that we have within our equipment, especially the more sensitive equipment. Then what could be just as bad for equipment is insufficient power. We call this brownouts. So if we have enough power to power some of our equipment, but not all of our equipment, that we just can't get enough power to it, then what will happen is that some of our equipment will start coming online and offline, and it will go up and down. And that can be very damaging to equipment. Then there's also unconditioned power, or we call it noise on the line. And so your power actually has a frequency, it's a wave. And so what noise on a wave would look like this. And that can cause problems with certain equipment as well, especially things like communication equipment. So then the question is how do we protect our equipment? And one way is by limiting the physical access to our equipment, especially things like network switches and hardware that we have running within our data center. We're going to want to make sure that's a very controlled environment, and we're only letting certain people into that environment. And I get more in depth into access management in another module. And we almost always want some sort of asset management techniques. And part of that may be asset tracking. Things like we keep an inventory of what we have on hand, the assets that we have on hand. Perhaps we have some sort of GPS system that actually tracks that, so that way we can keep a track of where our assets are going. Perhaps we have some sort of barcodes or QR codes that get scanned in and out when we're doing audits or when it's passing by certain checkpoints. Or things that can automatically happen with things like RFID, where they have a little RFID tag on there that can signal when things pass certain lines or go past certain checkpoints. And it's important to know when things go askew. And so we have things like monitoring and alerting that can help out with that. We do have things like protocols such as Simple Network Management Protocol, which is a protocol that can help us manage and gain insight into what our network is doing. There's also event logs on specific pieces of equipment that will actually track what's happening on that piece of equipment. We got a syslog server and a syslog triggers and ways to record syslog events, which takes some of the events that happens on our servers and records it. So that way we can go and monitor that and look at it later. We also have different sensors, things like temperature sensors and moisture sensors that gives us additional information that's happening within our environment and within the different equipment that we have. What is nice to have is something like a dashboard, which puts it all together so we have a visual representation on what's happening on our network and with our different pieces of equipment. It uses things like log aggregation, where it takes the events logs and brings it all and puts it into one spot. And so it aggregates all those logs so that way we can identify if things are going awry on our equipment, things are going off on our equipment and on our networks, so that way we can take action. Of course, turning this all into some sort of alerting that actually alerts us when things go off, maybe sends us an email or a text message, so that way we can do some research and find out what's going on. And typically what I'll actually do is I'll have it send me an email if it's not urgent, or a text message if it is urgent. Or you can do a full operations center. So if you have a full NOC or network operations center, this is when people are actually staffed looking at those dashboards, looking at those places on your network and doing some investigation when things are a little bit off. So that way they can notify you or bring you on board if something's happening. So that's the NOC center. And you could have an internal NOC where you have people that are sitting there watching your network, or perhaps you can actually use a third party to help you do the network operations centers. We'd also want to put environmental controls into place. Things like fire suppression systems. And there's a lot of different types of fire suppression systems out there. So choosing the right fire suppression system for what you have. There's also, we need to be concerned about the environment from a moisture and a temperature standpoint. So making sure we have a good heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. We call that HVAC. And if you have an underpowered HVAC, it can't maintain a certain temperature and you'll have fluctuations, which causes damage to your equipment. So we need an HVAC system that's a significant, that is going to cover your needs for the size of data center or network closet that you have. We also want to plan against electrical threats. So we have some sort of power redundancy, some sort of backup generator if we have a blackout, or some sort of uninterrupted power supplies. So this can help out with if there's a blackout, or also things like it can condition the power so you don't have noise on your line that's causing interference with your equipment. And we do have to think about the full life cycle, the choosing and purchasing of equipment. We have to think about the rolling it out and hardening of the equipment. We have to think about the maintenance of it. And we also have to think about the asset disposal. And a lot of equipment doesn't necessarily have a hard drive on it that we are going to have a bunch of data on it and concerned about the data. But even the configurations can be used from a threat agent. As an example, is if we were just just throw the firewall that we have into the recycling, somebody could go onto that firewall and start looking at the configurations of that and gaining information about your network and how to leverage vulnerabilities on your network. And so what we'd want to do is, before we actually threw something away, or before we disposed of it, before we threw it in the recycling, before we got rid of it, we want to make sure that we wipe any configurations off of it. We would want to make sure we perform some sort of factory reset on it to make sure that everything is wiped, or some sort of device sanitization. Perhaps we even just crush it or send it off to somebody that will dispose of it correctly to make sure that it's disposed of correctly. So as you can see, there's a lot more threats than just a simple threat agent out there. There are hardware threats, there are environmental threats, and there are electrical threats. Things that can damage our equipment or cause it to come offline and cause those availability issues. So we're going to want to put some sort of protection into place. Things like access control. We're going to want to put in asset tracking, hardware monitoring, environmental controls, and asset disposal. The things that are going to safeguard our pieces of equipment and our network.